So, who here has heard of Postman before? Hands up. Who's used it in any capacity whatsoever? Postman? What about Newman? Oh, a couple. That's pretty good. All right, cool. So, I know you all work in teams normally, and a lot of you are test engineers, and you thought you'd just see some cool stuff, but we're going back to BDD. So we're going to look at features. So first things first, and I apologise, my slides are nowhere near as professional as Ashish's. So this is a made-up feature. We've got a user, and I've got a made-up piece of value. So I want to be able to add items to my shopping cart. So everyone's seen this. You've worked in many industries where you add things to a shopping cart. Why do you want to do that? I've missed one. Because you want to be able to purchase it. That's the reason. That's the value. That's how we work.
So you picked it up because it's Black Friday today, right?
Exactly. Well, what a great tie-in, Black Friday. Now what happens with these features, we turn these into scenarios because we're proper BDD teams. We turn these into scenarios and they form our acceptance criteria. So I've also got a scenario. Now this would just be one that would make up the many criteria that we'd build from, say, maybe a story mapping session. So given I can browse all available items, when I add the item to my shopping cart, the item is reserved. So the concept here is, if anyone's ever worked at, say, an organisation that deals with holidays, they like to allow people to reserve a holiday for 15 minutes while they finish the booking process so that nobody jumps in and steals their place on the plane. That's this exact thing. What happens now, typically in the teams I've worked in, is we argue about implementation. We've got the value, we know what we want to test, it's testable. Now we're going to argue about how we're going to do this. I'm not an architect, I'm definitely not a developer, but I've got a sequence diagram, and this is what we're going to base the demo on. So we've got a consumer, we're going to act as the consumer, we're going to browse all the items, that's with a HTTP request. We've got this inventory service. Once we've got the items and we know which one we want, we're going to add it to our cart. This is probably where an architect would scream because a delete seems really hardcore for a reserve, but we're going to delete the item from the inventory so that no one else can take the item while we're finishing our purchase. And all we want to see back is that the cart said, yes, we've added it. Now, to test and I will jump back a slide, to test this scenario, you don't have to be a genius to work out that the process is probably going to be see what items we've got, pick one and add it to the cart, and then check that the item's no longer in the inventory. It's reserved. Good enough. That's a test. So let me jump to here because I will revert to this, and I'm going to jump down to my laptop. And we're going to move into Postman. So this is Postman. This is blank. For those of you that haven't seen it, although it was almost all of you that have seen this before, I'm not going to talk through the UI too much. I'm just going to jump straight into it. Now, something I didn't mention when I was talking about our fictitious team is that we're good teams. We're building our API designs first. We're not jumping straight into implementation. So what we've got to work with are a couple of API specs. So I can look at the API spec here and the API spec here. And on the left-hand side in the lighter shade, we've got the inventory. On the right-hand side, we've got the shopping cart. I'm not going to make you read YAML. That's pretty boring. But what I can tell you is the APIs look roughly similar. The concept is you get items, post items, delete items. They both deal with items, so the APIs look very similar. But what we can do is, and let me escape from here and here, is I can import those API specs directly into Postman, so I don't have to even build anything. I can choose my files. I need to go up a directory. I've got an API spec here and here. Import them both at once. And I've got a couple of collections. So straight away, I've got some stuff I can deal with. I can use this. I've even got a host. Now, where's that come from? This is a magic IP address. If I jump back to the API spec, and those of you familiar with Swagger API or Open API know that there's a hosts parameter that you can provide for, say, a default host. If it was your production or your staging environment, this might be where you store this. And if I take a look and jump to the bottom, where are we? You can see this hosts entry here. That's where Postman's reading that from. So I can actually just send this straight away. I haven't done anything. I haven't written even a bit of config. I can send this and get some items back. Now, I know I mentioned holidays, but I stupidly chose things that you'd find in Tesco's, like toothbrushes and toothpaste. We can add a new item. Now, what Postman doesn't do, which is really sad, is supplying the information about the body. So I have to actually supply this myself. I won't bore you, but I actually know the API because I wrote it. So I know it's a name that's required. Let's say it's a test item with some funky capitalization and a price of, say, I don't know, £400 or whatever unit we're using. Send this and I get back my item. And I get a 201 created because it's really RESTful. And I get an ID. So I've got an ID of 46. So this is a unique ID that's specified by the server at creation time, so a bit like an ID for a database. I can also delete items. That endpoint's really useful for the shopping service, which talks to this one, which allows us to reserve the item. I'm not going to go into too much more of testing these like this. One thing I will do before we move into building this proper test is say that Postman have really tried to grow into sort of a full API lifecycle tool rather than just a simple test tool. So there are a bunch of features in here that are lesser known. From that API spec written in YAML, I can publish some documentation, which, hoping the network works, will bring me out here. I can just publish this, and I can go to the link. And for my application that I was designing from the ground up, I've got some documentation for the API straight out of the box. I've even got curl requests that I can paste back into my terminal. Let me get rid of that. And let me pipe it to JQ so you can actually see what's going on. We get the same response. So that's quite nice to be able to just have, try out stuff in the browser or pull it into curl. The button that is also there at the top of this page is Run in Postman. So if I share this documentation with anyone else, they can download it as a collection and import it into Postman. So that's quite nice for sharing amongst teams, or even if you're using your API as a product, to give to your customers. Cool. So that's the documentation. Let's actually build the test that satisfies our scenario. So let me jump back to Postman. So what I'm going to do is a bit building blocky, really. I'm just going to puzzle piece this together. I know the flow of what I want to do. I've got the requests here, and then I'm just going to do a bit of JavaScripty testing to ensure everything's working. So first of all, I like to pretend I'm a good test engineer, and I'm worried about affecting other people's test data. So rather than just picking an item off of the shelf, I'm going to put one there and use that. So I'm going to duplicate this request, and I'm going to add a collection called, let's just call it out test. That'll do. So we create. Our test is sat here. It's got nothing in it. But where's my duplicate? The one called copy. That would be it. Let's move it in to there. And then I'm going to rename it into something a bit more easy to read. So this is create new item. I haven't got a body, so let's create a body. And it's the same as this. Test item for real. So we've added a new item. This is the one we're going to use to post into our shopping basket. So the next thing we're going to need is to be able to post into the shopping basket, which is this request down here. So let's copy this, drop it in there, rename, add item to shopping cart. Typos again, I'm not going to worry too much about those. My typing's not great at the best of times. Now, what you'll notice here, this is the first point we're actually going to do anything clever in Postman, is I've added an item. I want to then take the ID of that item and send it to the shopping cart so that I'm chaining requests. You'll probably see this more commonly in things like authentication. So you'll authenticate with something and then want to use a token or something you've got back and send that to another service. So from the request I sent here, I can look at the response, which if my mouse would scroll, there we go, the body. I've got this pretty basic JSON object that says name, price, and ID. So Postman, again, makes things really easy. So I've got this test tab here. Now, what that actually means is it will run everything in here after it's received a response. It doesn't have to be a test. There's some other stuff you can do. And this snippets window here is a godsend because it means I don't actually have to write any code. So given that it was a get, the response status code was 200. There's a little thing here saying check the status code was 200. That seems pretty sensible. Let's keep that in there. And I also want to extract some of the JSON. So I don't want to check the type, but this will probably have what I need. Yeah, so what I've got here is something to actually read the JSON. So let's take that and put that there, and then get rid of all that stuff. And then the last thing we want to do is actually save off that data into some variables that we can use for future requests. Now, there was something in here that I also saw saying set environment variable. Get environment variable, set an environment variable. Now, what this is saying is environment in Postman is the equivalent of scoping. There's complex scoping in Postman. I won't go into it too much because it's utterly boring. But the concept is environment is within a collection. Global can be used across collections, and then there are others that can be used in various other ways, but there's sort of smaller and smaller scopes. To use it, I actually have to supply an environment up here. So I'm just going to very quickly add one called demo. It's basically like just naming a scope. That will do. And then I can switch to it. So what I have the ability to do now is set environment variables. I had 3 that I wanted to capture from my last request. I might not use them all, but I'm just going to save them all off anyway. So I want, let's call it item name, item price, and item ID. Now, this comes from this object, dot name. Let's see if copy and paste will serve me well. No, it didn't. Price and ID. So now, if I send this again, I've got a test that passes. So that's my status code. But also, if I check my environment, nothing's happened. Amazing. Okay, interesting. Not a problem. That's a good point. Well done, thank you. If I send that now, yeah, I've captured it. So well done for that. I had a collection backup just in case that I messed this up. So we've created a new item. We've stored it off in our variables. We now want to add that item to our shopping cart. So we need some information here. This time we need to repeat the same object, but with the ID included in the request. So let's take this, copy and paste, jump into the shopping cart request, paste here. But now, instead of actually hard coding these, we're going to use some variables. Now, the way the variables work inside the Postman body, URL, headers, is with this double curly bracket notification. So I've got item name, item price, and item ID. This is JSON, so it will kick off unless everything's in a string, and Postman will do the templating for me at the point of sending. Something it does do, which is nice, is supply this code, so I can see what's going to be sent before it's sent. So I can see here, actually, my templating is now working. The services I've written will accept this string and will cast it to an actual price, so a float or something. So I can send this. I've got back a 201, which is great. And I get the object back that I've just created. So let's jump back to this diagram, because I don't want to keep going until I've figured out where I'm going. So I've browsed the items and I've added an item. So technically this whole journey is successful now. I could just make sure we get a 201. But what we wanted to do was verify that our item had been removed from the inventory. So first of all, let's drop this should be a 201 so that we are being nice and verbose. 201, 201. And let's save that one and save this one before we lose them. And now I'm going to add another request, which is to get all the items from the inventory. So again, I'm just going to clone this. I'm going to pull this in down here. And let's rename verify item is reserved. So now we need to do a bit of a funky test. This is where there's actually a little bit of JavaScript involved, and the reason I've done this is because this is a proper JavaScript engine. It's a small sandbox. You're effectively doing the same thing you would be if you opened up your Chrome console and started writing some JavaScript in there. It's the same engine underneath. The difference is you've got a few extra global variables like this PM, which is Postman, and it offers a bit of extra functionality. So first of all, we need to get the JSON data, which we did before. Again, I'm just going to pull this out of one of the examples so that I don't mess it up. So I've got the JSON data, and now at this point, all I want to do is check that the ID I received when I first created the item no longer exists in this list. So this is a list that comes back. It's an array of items. So what I can do is filtered data. I apologize for spelling again. JSON data dot filter item and I want to return item.id is loosely equal to my postman.environment. Spelling does matter here. Environment.get item ID. And then I can add a test on this. So I can do this manually. pm.test. Let's add something good. Verify item is no longer in the inventory. Takes a function. And I can say pm.expect filtered. Let's copy and paste it. I will get that wrong. Filtered data. Now, the assertion library. So some of you, at least those of you who've worked with JavaScript before, will spot this looks a lot like chai. That's because it is chai. So the nice human readable chaining language that chai's got. So I can say to be, I'm going to have to jump to chai. I can't even remember. Chai greater than. That's good enough. To have length of. Good enough. To have length of 0. Because in theory, we've removed it, so we shouldn't have anything in that list. So let's step through. I can create a new item, add that item to my shopping cart, and verify that it's removed, and I've got 2 tests to pass. Now, I never write a test that passes first time without breaking it, because I can guarantee I've done something wrong, and if I haven't, it will be a miracle. So let's set this to 1, and we can step through this again to make sure that this is now going to break my last test. Amazing. So it's even got a nice little bit of debugging for you. Expected length of 1, but got 0. Cool. So let's save that as well. So what we've got now is a test that runs, and I can actually use the Postman runner. So some of you will have seen this before as well, and we're going to step through all the various ways we can use this test now. How am I doing for time? Cool. So let's pick our collection. We don't need an environment. Oh, we do need environment, sorry, let's pick demo. 1 iteration, so you could run this many times with the delay if you wanted to, but let's keep things simple. Let's just run this. So we've run this. We've got 4 passes. It's all passed. That's great. We've even got a run summary that will give us things like response times if we break down into it far enough. So this is all well and good, but the thing you'll notice, and Ashish touched on this as well, is this is all in a UI. We've done a little bit of scripting, but again, it's in the UI. This isn't very useful for people that want to plug this into a continuous integration tool. We want to run this after a build. This is a great smoke test. So Postman offers that ability. So we can export this as a collection, which is basically just a big JSON file. I'm going to drop it in this directory. Let me kill one of these windows so we can see what we're doing. Let's go in there. In there. So you can see this Postman collection. I can have a look at it. I'll test. It's just a bunch of JSON. It's not very exciting. If you really wanted to write this yourself, you probably could, but it seems like a lot of syntax to learn. So I'm going to exit there. Now there's a tool called Newman. I mentioned it up front. It's an NPM package. You can install it globally if you really want to, or install it into a local project if you want to run it as part of a proper node project. I don't need -I. What am I doing? Now this should be pretty quick because I've already got this installed. But just to prove to you it's an NPM package, really. Oh, it's even updated it. Now my commands won't work, will they? So you can just run this like so, and you'll get if this passes, it does, great. You'll get a nice output. Tools like Jenkins that was mentioned earlier, absolutely love the traditional JUnit XML that gets kicked out of some tests, so it even supplies some runners so you can pass these in. I want the CLI, I want to see what it is. I want some HTML reports, and I want some JUnit XML. These are all little additional extensions to Newman. It's all open source, so there's hundreds of extensions that do all kinds of things. I can run this again. It should be pretty quick still. And then I get this Newman directory. And in here, I've got a bunch of XML and HTML. I'm not going to open the XML because it's JUnit XML and it's disgusting and horrible and no one wants to look at it. But I can open the HTML. So let's open the most recent. And you've got a little HTML report that you could show somebody if you wanted to. So that all seems pretty cool so far. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that Postman offers full API lifecycle support. So what we've got so far is design, documentation, build and test. What about mocking? We've got two components that talk to each other. We should try and mock because we want to test the shopping component in isolation from the inventory component. Other way around for you guys, sorry. So Postman does mocking, surprisingly. So I can take my inventory spec, which would be the one I want to mock. I can scroll back up. I can send this. I've got some data. I can click this examples button, add example, and save example. So I've saved this example response, and I can now create a mock. I can create this. It's given me a URL. Postman's really kind, so I can just close this, and it's given me this URL parameter. You'll notice it's in the same syntax as we used earlier, the double braces, and it's changed my environment for me. And if I have a look, it's specified the URL it created for me. So those of you who want to know how this works infrastructure-wise, what it's actually doing is deploying something into the cloud that acts as a really dumb HTML web server that responds with the canned data that you saved off. I can send requests here, but it won't work because I'm missing the path. So inventory items, and I get a response. Doesn't look very exciting because that's what we were seeing before, but I'm not talking to my deployed instance anymore. I'm talking to a mock. So we have complete control of this. We could do some really funky stuff with that. Not going to go too much into it. So mocking's one thing. We've now gone from API design, API build, API test, deploying those tests to CI so that we can get some continual running tests and reports. We've got mocks that we can use in our isolated teams. Now we want to push to production. Now, when you push to production, something you really want to be able to do is functional monitoring. Functional monitoring is the coolest thing on the planet. It means that the tests we write, we can run in production as long as they are idempotent. Now, I created data and used that data. I didn't clean up the cart, but let's ignore that. So that's technically idempotent. We can send that request over and over again and verify that those two components are talking to each other as a functional test. And we can use that in a monitoring tool. So send that request, say, once every 5 minutes, and we get verification that our applications are up and running, and we get an availability graph. Postman does that as well, surprisingly. So I can use our tests that we created here, and I can create a monitor. This might churn. It might churn. Don't worry, I've got one set up. Here's one I made earlier. Where are we? Postman. Demo reference. Where's my browse button? Monitors. Let's wait for it to connect. If the internet dies, I will have to you'll have to take my word for it. Okay, so I found them. I found some that I've prepared before. Where are we? A monitor, good, and it's failed. So the reason this has failed, I tore down the application, but what you can see here is something's gone wrong. So this is sending the exact same test we've just created every 5 minutes, and it's failing every time. And I know it's failing because my inbox is filled with notifications telling me it's failing. So I'm getting alerts from this as well. This will also link to other monitoring tools like New Relic, Datadog. It can post to Slack. It can post to Microsoft Teams. You can link almost anything to it. So Postman have really made this API publicly available and as a product of its own. There's obviously, if you want to use this cloud-based infrastructure, you have to pay for it. It's like $10 a month for an individual user or 20 for teams, I think. So it's not free and it's not open source. But Newman is, so if you want to go and see Newman and contribute to Newman, I recommend you do it. It's super powerful. And what I've just done there actually is created some documentation. I've verified it. I've written a smoke test that I could run in CI. I've deployed a mock and deployed a monitor in probably 20 minutes or so. So that's pretty powerful, especially for teams that are just coming up to speed with automation, as a dirty word. If they're going from complete manual testing into something they want to invest in automation, Postman's a great jumping off point for getting people involved because it's so simple to just add a couple of headers and then export to a collection and run it in Jenkins and you feel really cool about it. That's it. That's the entire demo. I've got one more slide that I will jump to. Let's present. So like I said, I'm not going to sit down and type anymore. I work at GFK. Please talk to Adam, talk to Bala, talk to Chris, where are you there? We can tell you about all the other cool things we do. We do use Gatling as well, but I'd never used the recorder, so I might go and play with that. I've got a blog. It's really basic, but I do occasionally add stuff there. And if you want any of the slides or example collections, they're all on my GitHub as well, so you can find me there. That's it.